Hey, everybody. Welcome to part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Kevin Chase from Washington State University, Wazoo Center of Professional Selling. We had a great conversation. I thought it was great. I think he did too, on authenticity in part 1. We're here to talk about persuasion. Dr. Kevin, are you ready to talk about persuasion and sales processes?
Absolutely. I'm always ready to talk about persuasion and sales processes.
I know you are. And what I love is I know that you are much more research focused, and that's the part that you do, right? Like you went all the way PhD, you're doing more research right now. It's the opposite of where my brain thinks of like the science and the research of all of it. So I'm excited to get your insight. For people tuning in now, and you're catching this as the very first episode of the conversation with Dr. Kevin, make sure once this is done, you go back and listen to part 1 on authenticity, because there was a lot of good stuff there. And 2, just so you know and get you caught up, is he is the assistant professor of marketing and then also the director of the sales program at Washington State University's Pullman campus. Prior to getting a PhD, he worked in various roles in sales and marketing. He was in the commercial insurance industry. We talked about his time in Cutco selling knives when he first got into sales, air quotes, like realizing that it was sales, and then his path here. So, Kevin, the place I want to start first is something you said towards the end of the previous conversation, talking about authenticity, talking about empowering your students and salespeople in general to make it their own, right? Take this framework, understand this product, understand this process, and then make it your own so that it's authentic. So it's you. And the part you were tying in was not trying to copy or play the part of salesperson or be what you think a salesperson is supposed to be, in the same way like when you started with teaching as a professor, what you thought a professor was supposed to do versus your own style. My question to you, because this is to me almost a dangerous thing to teach and support salespeople on, which is that balance. Like, where is that balance? Just like the professor side, if I'm like, you just teach however you want, and then who knows what's going to happen. So there's got to be some guidelines and some boundaries. Obviously, there's an end result that's the key in both teaching and then also sales. But where is that balance between here's authenticity and then here's a process we know works as a business, and we want you to go sell using our framework, but balanced with you being you?
I think a lot of it comes down to any good plan. For example, I mentioned I played sports a lot growing up, right? So football, for example, you may have a set number of plays that tend to work really well. Your team is really good at executing, right? And then when you face a particular opponent, maybe some plays work better and some plays don't work quite as well. And so what you're doing is taking kind of your playbook and adapting to your opponent, right? And not that I see sales as like an adversarial opponent. I'm sure some customers feel that way sometimes. But a lot of it is really having a good structured plan and then figuring out what it is that you execute really well and making that kind of your own, like your own approach. A lot of it, I also think, comes down to personality and style. So there are certain things that some people are much more extroverted, much more talk oriented, and that's okay. And in certain situations that may work really well, but then also in other situations, you may be dealing with a customer that's not quite as extroverted, and that might be very tiring for them. And understanding what your personality is and boosting it when it makes sense, and then also tempering it down when it doesn't make sense, right? And so a lot of what I think making it your own style is taking pieces of yourself and fitting it to the playbook within your industry, so to speak. But bring it all the way full circle.
And I'm glad that you put it that way, because again, there's that balance with this is the playbook. These are the plays that can work. These are what we've practiced. These are what you know. And then making it your own and then reading the situation. I think your football analogy is great, which is sometimes the quarterback at the line of scrimmage, for people who know sports, maybe not, the other team on defense is doing something. It doesn't fit with what you were thinking about doing. So you have to mix it up on the fly and go. and hopefully that adjustment works, it's still within the plays. The whole team has to know the play. You can't just be like, let's just mix it up and we'll just wing it. And I think that's where a lot of people in sales, this is what I see, is the natural born salespeople, or that extroverted, charismatic person who thinks I'm going to get into sales because I like talking to people and selling people. They just want to do what they do best and show up and just given free reins to go through whatever process they want versus the playbooks and things like that. What was that like for you, or what did you learn worked as a process for persuading people at scale, both the Cutco, or maybe even more applicable is the commercial insurance when you're doing like professional sales? Like, what was a process you found worked, and maybe how was that different than you thought a salesperson should sell?
I had just a poor understanding of what sales was when I started, right? With knives, I thought, again, sales was just pushing products on people, or like having products and people would just make decisions based on being like the information that I presented, which, as we all know, is not generally the way that good sales people operate. And so for me, what I found resonates the most is really getting deep down, good understanding of what the customers are trying to do, right? Whether it's to minimize risks or reduce sorts of losses or whatever it is within their organization, or if there's specific goals that they're trying to reach within their organization, really understanding and getting the customer, or having the customer explain so I understand what they're trying to do, and then tailoring a solution that matches those goals, whatever those goals are, right? And so that's a very simplistic way of looking at it. For me, really understanding the customer was paramount to being successful, especially in commercial insurance and selling knives too, for that matter.
And so that's something you figured out. And then how do you help the future salespeople understand that and move past that part where they're worried about not having the skills and the confidence, like we talked about in part one, where they don't know the product, they don't know the script, they feel like they have to play the part, to then getting to that point, which you just talked about?
So one of the things that we always talk about within our program is I teach process, not product. Okay. And so what I mean by that is we have 300 plus students coming through our sales classes every year and on the Pullman campus, and they're all going to go into very different industries, right? Some, like I mentioned before, may go into like wine and spirit sales. Some may do commercial insurance. Some may do tech sales. Some may work. We have a lot of students that come from ag backgrounds that are trying to get into the ag industry and doing like heavy machinery sales. All these different types of products, services. Some may be inside sales reps. Some may be outside sales reps, right? There are tons and tons of different types of sales roles. And so for us, we're not really trying to teach you, I'm not trying to teach you how to be an inside sales rep for a commercial insurance company. My goal is to really show the students all the different processes that exist out there so they're aware. So when they get into whatever role they have, they can learn and understand what the company's trying to do with the processes that they're getting trained in at whatever company that is. So for us, we start very basic with spin selling. It's a foundational sales methodology that's over 30 years old at this point. And a lot of the new sales methodologies build on top of it. And what it does is it really gets students to understand that sales starts with understanding customers, right? And the spin methodology with the questions helps them to understand that, hey, if I understand the customer's problems, if I understand how those problems are impacting the customer, and I can show the customer how choosing a solution can help them, that's going to set me up for success in sales. And then we build more methodologies on top of that, where by the time that they leave here, they really understand that sales is a customer focused position, understanding customer needs, providing solutions that help customers hit their goals, right?
So what's interesting, you're talking about like process, not product, but it seems like most companies teach product, not process. I won't say all, but most of the sales training I've ever seen in a company or working with companies or just observing, is all about their product. As long as you know the product, and then here's a little bit of a process. The process part is the fundamental. That's the more universal part, right? And so if that's the case, like, how are you teaching something that is applicable, or are you teaching a lot of different processes and basically tools in a toolbox and letting them know when it's right to use which tool for which need?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Our intro level sales class, for example, we're teaching them just the basics spin selling process. That's the only process we teach in that class, to just get students to understand that a good salesperson is understanding customers' problems and helping match solutions to those problems. In our more advanced sales classes, that's when we start to bust open and show, okay, like maybe we just showed you a hammer in the intro level class, but now we're showing you 57 other tools that you can potentially use depending on where you are. So, for example, in my advanced sales class that I teach, we do a lot of stuff working with CRM systems and do some stuff with the HubSpot Training Academy. And the first half of the class is focused on inside sales. And here are different processes for creating outreach emails, cold calling, sequencing of your contacts, managing those contacts in a CRM system. The second half of the class is now focused more on outside sales, where we're teaching another process, customer-centered selling, where, okay, this is how customers' needs evolve over time. Most sales, you're not going to make a sale on one meeting or one call. It's going to occur over multiple calls with multiple decision makers. So how do you progress through a sales process that may take weeks, months, or even years in certain situations? How do you deal with different types of decision makers? You may be dealing with an engineer and procurement. You may be dealing with a business manager or a project manager, right? How do you deal with those processes? What the students see is, again, they start seeing all these different tools and processes that are out there. So the hope is that when they take a job, let's say they end up doing inside sales for a tool manufacturer, for example, they say, hey, oh, I know that we covered the basics of that process in class. Here's where I can go to get more information if my company doesn't have a sales process already established. So it's creating a lot of awareness. So when they get out and they do take these jobs, they're aware of the different tools that they can access to help them be more successful.
So let's shift, because you said something about the buyer side, which I think is important if we're going to talk about sales process, all these processes versus products. And especially if we continue the authentic side, what do you see and or have research for, because I know you're a big research guy, is what buyers, again, industry doesn't matter or shouldn't matter, but what buyers are looking for from a salesperson, from a sales process, and so on?
Fundamentally, it comes down to buyers are hoping that salespeople can help them make better decisions. And so I've actually spent the last year working with a lot of different buyers on a research project, trying to understand how salespeople help them make decisions. And one of the things that was really fascinating to me is the fact that I think we've heard a lot over the last 5-10 years about how access to information has empowered buyers, have helped them. They're more informed. They're more likely to do all the decision making on their own. And in certain instances, that's 100% true. But the interesting thing is that we're finding, or what we found with a lot of the buyers that we were talking to, is that there's more access to information, but there's also a lot of the stuff that they're buying is way more complex than it ever was before. And so just because there's more information doesn't necessarily mean that they know what information is relevant to their decision making, because the purchase is so complex. And so what we found is a lot of buyers are starting to use a process where they'll actually reach out to salespeople to gather like RFI, request for information, be like, I don't even know what's out there. Tell me what I should even be looking at. They take that information from salespeople and then they start to do more targeted search. They start to gather more information. They'll talk to salespeople to help get an idea of what their solution should be. And then they'll go out and talk to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 suppliers and start comparing these solutions against each other. And they really need to rely on these salespeople to be the experts that they don't have time to be. Because another thing that I think a lot of people are forgetting is that most buyers, people that are making purchases, their job isn't to purchase this. Yeah, there's procurement people out there, but a lot of the decision makers, if I'm a business manager and I'm managing a department that does order processing and I'm buying an order processing software system, that's not my job. My job is to make sure that orders get processed, right? I can't spend 50 hours a day researching all the different order processing systems. I need somebody to help me figure out what I should even be looking at and helping me compare all the different options that are out there. And so in a lot of industries, salespeople are becoming even more important due to this complexity.
And what I'll say, like looking at my own journeys and experiences from a buying side, whether it's personally or business wise, is that I feel like that same way. There's so much information. I could Google to try to find like what would be a good CRM, let's say. And there's so many things, and they're all going to be sponsored stuff by each one, or maybe some site that lists the top ones and it's probably like somehow sponsored or paid for, or there's revenue share and stuff like that. And it's okay, I can start there. Let me talk to some. Let me get some information that will inform me enough to then go back for a second round and really ask questions. And I think that's interesting because I hadn't thought about that. I thought about, because of the internet and access to data, leveling the playing field, and buyers can make better choices and make them on their own, or at least know where to start. And I think that's true if it's a simple purchase, cuts out a lot of the conversation or need for salespeople. Like if you have enough experience with it and you know exactly what you want, literally buy a car from a vending machine. That's how much people do not want to deal with salespeople. Now, however, if it's complex, or like you said, which I love, it's not your job, right? You're not a professional software buyer. You are a fill in the blank. That's what you do. You just need a tool, or you've been tasked with buying it. Then it's like, it's a long, painful process. And then who do you find? Who do you trust? And so how do you build that process, or how do you help the future salespeople understand what the buyers want?
A lot of it, again, is going to come down to building relationships. So one of the projects, for example, that I talk about with my students in class all the time, my dissertation looked at selling to the government, for example. And so, like, for anybody out there that's listening or watching this that's sold to the government, how complex and what a pain it is to do that, and all the regulations that there are in place that govern how you interact with buyers during kind of the bidding process or the RFP process, depending on what you're selling. And what we found is that in order to be really successful in selling in that space, a lot of what you need to do is develop relationships with the buyers and the decision makers before they even have any idea that they need to make a purchase, right? So IT, for example, one of the things, I was talking to a senior VP of IT, and he said, one of the things that I love is the lunch and learns with the sales reps, because IT technology is changing so quickly. Again, this is a government agency, for example. These information technology changes so quickly that I need somebody to tell me the new stuff that I should care about. And so the thing is, when we get to a point where we know we're going to make a purchase, those are the people we're going to be familiar with. I'm going to be familiar with their products, and we may have a very structured RFP process, but I'm already going to be familiar with those products and services. Versus somebody I've never heard of before, it's going to be a lot harder for me to evaluate them through this really structured process. So again, backing it up to your original question about how do we teach that with the students, a lot of what I talk about with students in my class is how important prospecting is becoming now. And again, a lot of times people think of prospecting in terms of, oh, I need to find somebody that's ready to buy now. The problem is, in complex purchases, you need to find somebody that's going to be ready to buy in like a year or two, because you need to start educating them. You need to start working with them. You need to start understanding what their needs are so you can give them the information that they need, and they have time to actually process that information, understand that information. So when they get ready to make a purchase, they don't have to wait. Because if I know nothing about a purchase and then all of a sudden I get 5-10 RFP responses and I have to evaluate all of those, it's going to take forever. And a lot of times what we're seeing, there's even a book that just came out about it called The Jolt Effect of Buyer Indecision. We're getting to the point now where there's so much information. A lot of times salespeople aren't losing sales. It's that buyers just simply aren't making decisions, right? And so again, this proactiveness is becoming even more important in the sales process.
It makes so much sense in how you're talking about that, because I think it might be called the decision paradox or the choice paradox, which is as there's more choices, it's harder for someone to pick because our brain doesn't like that many options, especially if there's lots of options. It doesn't know which one's the best or the safest one. And then it's better to do nothing than pick something. And so with that's how we're relating it to the internet too, which is something interesting that I hadn't thought about, which is, okay, the internet's great. It helps empower buyers, but then at what point does it tip over into now it's hurting the process because there's too much? What's fascinating about what you talked about was prospecting isn't about finding someone who's right today. Really, it's about starting that conversation that will eventually lead to it, right? Like you're planting seeds in a long-term relationship instead of a, hey, buy some knives for me today or else. It's a, let's start this conversation. It's the same reason I think a lot of people go to conferences and trade shows as a business, let's say on the buyer side, because they're going to find out what they don't know that they don't know to help get information and know where to start. Sit in a session and learn about this thing that they wouldn't even have thought to search on the internet because they didn't even know what they didn't even know. And that's what you're talking about, is this buyer who's not a professional buyer doesn't know what they don't know, and they have no idea where to start. Someone's never bought a CRM or been involved with CRMs before. Where do you even start? There's so many, and everyone thinks theirs is amazing. But now what do you do? And it's like this terrible analysis paralysis. And I love how you're talking about teaching the future salespeople what their role is. Get away from that, making a sale on this first interaction or closing a deal in that transactional mindset versus this long-term mode. And how do the students respond to that when you're teaching them about what buyers are really facing?
I think it's one of those things that it's something that is really hard for them to grasp at this point in time. What I see it more as is not that they're going to go out and immediately be developing relationships with people that they're going to sell to 2 years down the line, but this is something that as they get into their sales career and they start to progress, this is something that they're going to look back on and realize that, hey, this is something that I need to do, like in certain roles that, hey, I remember we talked about this in class. This is something that I need to work on if I really want to get better, right? So again, this kind of goes back to the process thing where I'm trying to show them a whole bunch of tools that are out there. And it's my hope that in the future, when they're applicable, they'll be able to reach back and say, hey, this is something that I need to utilize in my role right now. Because one of the things that we do in our classes, we do a lot of role playing, and it's really hard to do a role play of a buyer that's not going to buy anything for another like year or two. And that's the constant challenge with a lot of the stuff that we teach is it's okay, this stuff's out here, but it's really hard to practice unless you're in a very specific role.
I'm just laughing because I'm imagining that role play of an enterprise level solution for an enterprise buyer where it's a 12 to 18 month sales cycle. It's like, how are you closing that sale in whatever that portion is that you're talking about? And, or how do you simulate a sales cycle like in that frame of mind? I remember one time I was a new sales manager in something I'd never sold, and they wanted me to sell first and learn it, and then I could grow the team, which made sense. Like, I wanted to know what it was like to sell it and the challenges. And my boss that I role played with, he played a very difficult customer with lots of objections and issues and challenges. And I had no idea what I was doing. He's throwing like all the terrible stuff at me and literally like the worst scenario. And it didn't help at all. It was like, this makes me want to quit. This was brutal. And so like, where's that value of role playing of here's what you got to learn, but here's like real world scenarios. And then where's that balance, which I think is a good segue for us to close out this part. We're going to talk about the future of sales next in part 3, which I think is going to be fun. We'll talk about people, we'll talk about technology, where all that's going. Dr. Kevin, for people who want to find out more or connect with you, LinkedIn, Dr. Kevin Chase, it will be in the show notes. Also, they can find Washington State University, Pullman, the professional sales program, that will be in the link, or you can Google it. It's on the wsu.edu website. Thank you again for being here and sharing all this. And I'll probably say it at the end of the part 3 as well, but thank you for all the work that you're doing with students and helping them see what sales could be like instead of playing the part of a salesperson, and really shifting it to where do buyers see the value? What do they need? And then how do you fulfill that? So thank you for being here and being a part of the show.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure on both counts. Thanks so
Yeah.
much.
And for everyone tuning in, thank you for being here. Make sure to stay tuned for part 3. If you didn't catch it, make sure to check out part 1 on authenticity. And as always, thank you for being here and being a part of this journey and helping fill the world with authentic persuaders.